Hello and welcome to the Australia Institute's webinar, Food Waste in Australia is today's topic. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land in which I am speaking from today. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders and to their history of community and care that they've bestowed upon this country for thousands of years. I'd also like to pay my respects to all elders past, present, and emerging, and also pay my respects to any mob First Nations individuals who are with us on this webinar today. Sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, I'm Nina Gbor, the director of the Circular Economy and Waste Program, under which today's webinar is occurring. This is a webinar of the Australia Institute. It is a program that focuses on research solutions and policies for holistic circular systems within Australia. And of course, food waste is part of that conversation. So we are very, very happy and excited to have you all on today's webinar. Please visit our website to know of days and times of upcoming webinars and events. So just a few little guidelines for today's webinar, just to make sure everything goes splendidly. If you hover over the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a function where you can ask questions of our panelists. And you can basically upvote questions and also make comments. Now, my colleague Evie will be moderating the questions, and we'll do our absolute best to answer as many questions as possible, but unfortunately, we won't be able to get through to all of them. So please, we ask that you keep things civil, keep it sweet, keep it short. Otherwise, we might have to boot you out of this webinar. And please don't make us do that, because we really don't like it when we have to, okay? So we'll finish the webinar around 12 p.m. This discussion is being recorded, and it'll be posted on our website and YouTube channel afterwards. Now, to start, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Ronni Kahn and Paul West. And I'll start with Ronni. Ronni is the founder and CEO of OzHarvest and has spent 19 years building OzHarvest and discovering along the way what it takes to be an activist, a change maker, and a true leader. So in 2018, the independently produced documentary Food Fighter premiered in Australia, and in 2020, Ronni's memoir, A Repurposed Life, was published by Murdoch Books. Some of her most notable some of her most notable awards and appointments include Australia's Local Hero, Australia's Local Hero, Australia of the Year Awards. And Ronni was also appointed as an officer, AO, of the Order of Australia, a United Nations Environment Program ambassador and speaker, and also a top 100 innovator as named in the Australia Business Review 2022. Now, there are so many more. There's a long list of awards and appointments, but I'll just mention.
Tell me, Ronni.
No, it's enough, honestly.
I'll just mention, which I think is important to mention, that Ronni has received an honorary doctorate from the University of South Australia. So we're really excited that you've joined us today, Ronni. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Pleasure.
And I'm equally excited to introduce Paul West. Paul has spent his life digging into the world of food, growing it, cooking it, and sharing it. So as a presenter of the iconic River Cottage Australia series on SBS Australia, and also a co-founder of Grow It Local, Paul has been inspiring people to get their hands dirty and connect with their food for more than a decade, right? And he believes that not only are backyard and urban food growers making the world a better place, they might just save it. So we'll begin our conversation with Ronni. So Ronni, tell us about OzHarvest's work in collaborating with supermarkets to minimize food security for Australians.
So first of all, thank you so much. And I too just would like to acknowledge that my feet are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my deep respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people and anyone who is listening and on this webinar today. So I think it's very fair to say that when I started OzHarvest, I did not begin with supermarkets. It took a while for supermarkets to come on board because, of course, the fear of liability was always a huge issue for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only once we'd had laws changed in 2000 and starting in 2005 did it even become a possibility for supermarkets to start giving us some of their surplus food. So I think, you know, I've read through the report and I totally understand and realize how important supermarkets are in our food lives. But I also want to stress very from the very outset that each and every one of us has huge power with supermarkets. Supermarkets put on their shelves what we buy. Every single time, if we choose to reject ugly fruit and vegetables, supermarkets, and please know, I am not in the defense of any supermarket. I work with them and we work so closely to try and make sure that any of the surplus, given that surplus food is costing our economy $36 billion worth every single year. And the supermarket, you know, we know that your report has come out with some really interesting stats. So supermarkets are committed to making sure that their surplus goes to feed individuals in the first instance. That wasn't always the case. That has shifted now, certainly for Woolworths, who is our major partner. We work with Woolworths, Aldi, and any of the small supermarkets. And it's very clear that they've now understood that surplus food that is good enough to eat should go to feed people in the first instance. So that is a big shift, because we were fighting with the notion that organic waste might go and feed animals. There is a shift in certainly the big supermarkets that we work with towards making sure that good surplus food goes to feed vulnerable people. And, you know, I read the report and I'm not 100% sure that I agree that supermarkets, it's in their interests to have food waste. I don't actually agree. I think that they understand what it costs them, which is why they support making sure that good food goes to feed people rather than goes to landfill.
Okay.
But we work with about 3,000 food donors to make sure that we're collecting surplus. But, you know, as much as we can do, we can only collect what we're capable of collecting. So if we know that 7.6 million tons of food is going to waste every year, yeah, we are only, and I'll just check on my stat on how much food we collect. I know it works out to around 30 million meals a year, which is equivalent to about 15 million tons of food. So, you know, we are only collecting this amount. And the most exciting part is our role in not wasting food, I believe.
Yeah. Okay. So, which leads on, you know, you spoke about you don't believe that it's in the best interest for supermarkets, major supermarkets, to encourage or support food waste in any way. What role do you think these major supermarkets play in food waste crisis, and how do cosmetic standards and things like sell by dates, use by dates impact waste?
Well, there's not any doubt that labeling is another whole question. And we are very aware that use by dates and labeling is a huge reason that people waste food.
Sure.
And I think that taps into this whole notion of education, of explaining. Certainly, I think that it was originally a bit of a consumer a plot to make us buy more, to have use by dates and labeling. And I think that there's, you know, we are working towards shifting and changing what that looks like, as we know all of us should be.
Yeah.
We have to work on shifting and changing that. I don't want to go into one of the solutions right yet. That's based on work that we've done, but unless you would like me to right now, but when I say that individuals, each and every one of us has a role to play, we absolutely do. And it's based on research that we've done with Monash University and behavior works, but I can go into that in depth after if you want to bring Pauline onto the conversation right now, or you'd like me to keep talking.
That was actually one of the questions I was going to ask, if you could share some of the findings from your research with Monash University. So might actually be appropriate after all.
Okay, so I think it's really important to understand that initially OzHarvest really was working B2B. We were collecting surplus from all these businesses and delivering it direct to our charitable organizations, around 2,500 organizations that we support. But given that we're both a social and an environmental organization, it became very clear that, and given that in 2015, we got our country to commit to halving food waste, even before the UN SDG goals had been assigned. And we now know that in 2030, by 2030, the intention of the UN SDG goals is to halve food waste. So it became very apparent that if we know that households are responsible for 40% of all food waste, that we needed to start working with households, which is why we did the research with Monash University in the first place, to understand what it takes to shift behavior, because this is what our biggest challenge is. We've become a very consumptive society. We're a convenience society. We want supermarkets open 24/7, and we want to just grab and we want to just use and then rebuy. And we look at all those labeling and we say, oh, well, we keep throwing out and we keep buying again. And so the research we did showed, and what we did within that research was, what is the most likelihood? We did a likelihood matrix of behavior of what we as individuals are willing to do. And it was done with a very large demographic. And I subsequently have the beautiful results of the impact report since we rolled out the learnings. So the learnings showed that actually the top behavior that we are willing to do is actually to use up our leftovers. Our challenge is we're not always sure how to do that. So as a result, we worked with independent pro bono PR company called RGA to come up with what could we do to encourage people to not waste food. And we came up with Use It Up tape. And it sounds so simple, but if we know that people are willing to use up their leftovers, but don't really know how could we make it easy for them to use up their leftovers? So the intention of Use It Up tape, and I'll just do this very quickly, is that you put this strip of tape, which is a world first, and it's created sustainably, and it says, use me, pick me, cook me, eat me, is to put that on a shelf in your fridge. And you move up everything onto that shelf that needs to be used up first. Your leftover broccoli, half open yogurts. And the phenomenal, exciting thing is that we've now had 45,000 families use It Up tape. And it has saved them. They have minimized their food waste in both fruit, veggies, dairy, and meat by 40%. It means it's saving them approximately $2,500 to $3,000 a year. So we're very excited about Use It Up tape and believe it's got to get into every single household, because it is available free from OzHarvest. So if you go onto our website, all you have to do is order some Use It Up tape, because we need every single person to be using it. Because you know why? Not all of us can afford a Tesla. Not all of us can afford to put solar on our roofs. If we want to be climate activists and eco warriors, all you need is Use It Up tape.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Ronni. I have another question for you, but I think we should talk Paul just to
So
make
do
sure
I.
that we get Paul's input in here.
Because he's got
So,
such
I could,
wisdom and
I mean, he's not
beautiful
just here to look
knowledge.
pretty, you know.
I could listen to Ronni talk
We
all
do
day.
need we do need to hear about Grow It Local. So, Paul, we know that supermarkets don't hold all the power when it comes to our food supply, right? And so tell us about Grow It Local and your mission to basically grow more food growers.
Well, thanks, Nina, and thanks, Ronni, and thanks everyone for joining. It's a great way to be spending a Wednesday morning having a discussion like this. I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from Burrunganj, land of the Yuin people on the far south coast of New South Wales. Pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and all First Nations people that may be joining us on this call or on this webinar. So a little bit about Grow It Local. We figured a long time ago that one of the most powerful ways that people can engage with environmental change and behavior change is through the lens of growing food. Ronni mentioned the UN SDGs earlier, and it's well documented that urban agriculture directly impacts 15 of the 18, and as a flow-on effect actually impacts all of the SDG sustainable development goals. So we've on a mission to really get more people to grow food. And as a part of that, we've so far in Australia got a community of 30,000 backyard, balcony and windowsill food growers that we know are cultivating over 1 million square meters of vegetable gardens. And we've done an impact report over the last 3 years. It's a continuation of the 2014 study from the Australia Institute, the potential impacts and value of home food growing. And the more that we dig into that, the more we realize there are some really potent behavior changes that take place when people start growing food. The first of which is when people start composting. So looking at food waste from the consumer perspective or from people at home, I can see from that Australia Institute study that approximately 312 kilograms of food waste per person occurs in Australia, which is an absolutely astronomical figure and very frightening. And we know the impacts of what happens when organic waste goes into landfill. But something that does happen when people start to grow their own food is they start to value food waste or any sort of organic material as a potential input for compost, for worm farming, for bokashi, depending on where you are. Now, obviously, it's better to make sure that it's actually consumed as food in the first place by some of those wonderful mechanisms and strategies that Ronni outlined earlier about just respecting food and using it up before it goes to waste. But inevitably something will go to waste, and composting has a huge impact. So we know that our community is composting on average 56,000 kilograms of food waste every week, and that every person that composts in Australia diverts about 2.5 kilograms of food waste every week. Now, that doesn't, that's on average 100 kilograms per person per annum, which doesn't go to the full 312 kilograms per person per year. But that's certainly coming from the home environment, and that 300 kilogram figure is skewed by the amount that's being wasted by the supermarkets. So we can see that when people grow food, they start to respect it much more deeply. And it's not about becoming self-sufficient. It's not about like trying to, become a market gardener and grow everything yourself. It can be as simple as growing just a couple of herbs or lettuces, some really easy to grow stuff in pots on a balcony, or being a member of a community garden. But another important behavior change that we've noticed come about as a result of people starting to grow food is that 90% of the people in our impact study, the Grow It Local report, which will be released on Monday, 90% don't care about food being wonky or food being, not beautiful in the classic supermarket sense. So in that instance, because they've gone to the effort of growing their own food, they know that things don't come out perfectly, and they know that they still have an amazing taste. So for us, it's about empowering people to grow food, because when people grow food, they care about food. They don't want to waste it. They do things like pickling, preserving, and all those wonderful things to avoid food being wasted in the first place. And if it does get to the stage where it's kind of not fit for human consumption, then it's composted or worm farmed. And in my own household, we've been composting for decades now, and you get sometimes you go to a friend's house and they don't compost, and instead of taking a doggy bag or leftovers from dinner, you're like, oh, I'll take a plastic container, and can I take your scraps home, please? Because seeing someone scrape leftover food into a bin is just it kind of makes my toes curl a little bit, as I'm sure anyone that composts at home does. So the more that we can encourage people to engage with that simple behavior change of growing food, and to further to what Ronni said, not everyone can own a Tesla, not everyone can put solar panels on their roof, but if you use the use it up tape, and you manage the food that's in your fridge, and as another very easily accessible extension to that, grow at least some portion of your own food. It's not about growing it all. It's not about saying, I'm going to turn my whole backyard into a market garden, but all those behavior changes come no matter how much you're growing. So it may just be growing a small container of loose head lettuce or herbs that you sprinkle over your food. But if you do that, you waste less and you care about food more, which are, incredible outcomes in diverting food from landfill.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for that lengthy answer.
Also,
no, that's a very good thing. I'll tell you why, because you sort of answered my next two questions, which I was going to ask, talk us through how, growing your own food in our backyards and plots reduces food insecurity and food waste. And you also touched on some of the findings from the report that's coming out publicly on Monday.
Yeah.
So
well,
if there's anything else you want to add to that, please.
Yeah, I think what the biggest challenge that we also know is that we've lost the value of food.
Yes.
We used to having a supermarket that has food in it 24/7.
Yeah.
Produce, the reason their cherries out of season is because we buy them.
Yeah.
If we didn't buy them, nobody would put them on the shelf. Supermarkets put there what we buy.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I say we are so powerful. We have the ability to change. And, what I do know in the supermarkets, that one of their biggest growing categories is the odd bunch or the ugly, imperfect fruit and veg, wonky fruit and veg. And of course, it's still always a challenge that produce that's fresh gets put into plastic. It's another whole issue that we try to work with. But the point is, we have a lot of power.
Yeah.
And like Paul says, there is nothing more exciting than pulling out your own carrot, looking at it, and it seems to taste so much more delicious, even if you're buying organic produce.
Yeah. Now, Ronni, you mentioned the odd bunch, the ugly fruits and vegetables, quote unquote ugly. They taste just as good when they're cooked or eaten.
Yes, they do.
So, there's this chicken and egg conversation about aesthetics and fresh produce, right? The major supermarkets, well, most supermarkets, major and small, will tell you that it's the customers. And of course, we're very visual, particularly in the West, very visual people, where, we want that perfectly round, pink apple, shiny, very waxed lemon that shines and things like that. So of course, it's understandable that the supermarkets say that, it's the customers that drive it. However, there's this argument as well that, that standard was created by the capitalist major supermarkets. When you have competition, we're taught, that's a learned behavior that we're taught to, because, as supermarkets compete with each other, they only stock the shiny vegetables, the perfectly shaped vegetables. And that's what we've become accustomed to. And that's what we demand. So how do you feel about that conversation?
I think there's definitely no doubt that initially supermarkets, first of all, created shelves, and it's neater and tidier to put produce. If all your cucumbers are the same size, it's much easier than if they're very weird and ugly and an interesting shape. But I think we have shifted the dial. We haven't shifted it enough, because there's still people who would rather have a banana without a freckle than a banana with a freckle. It's like, is that how you choose your friends? They've got
for some people,
But in truth, it is about education. And I think that is why it's so important. We've got education programs, a program called FEAST, Food Education and Sustainability Training. And it goes into years 5 and 6 in primary schools, and this year we've just launched it into high schools, year 7 and 8. And the whole purpose is to teach sustainability, understanding produce, understanding and encouraging growing, but also understanding that you choose how to cook, how to look after yourself, and how to live a sustainable life. And what we're finding, I mean, the program is very much around cooking, eating, understanding, composting. And the point is, what we're seeing is those kids take these messages back home. So we need these, our program is curriculum accredited, and we're certainly not in every school, you know, and the teachers and the principals of the 1,000 or more schools that we've delivered this program in love it, because they don't have time to create these programs. Home economics and all of those programs that once existed don't exist anymore. And it starts with teaching little people the value of food, how to cook, how to build menus that are both budget conscious and using beautiful produce that isn't about how it looks, rescued produce or surplus, or the produce that you choose in the supermarkets shouldn't be about its cosmetic value, but about the produce. And so education is key to shifting children who grow up into adults and our adult, behavior.
Okay. Thank you so much for that. I think now we have to answer the audience questions because people are really keen and the questions seem to be really good. So I'll start with the first one from Kate Nissered. If unsold edible food donations was mandated, which businesses should this apply to, and what would need to be in place with regards to systems, infrastructure, capacity to support this and ensure it is successful? So anyone?
Well, can I just start? Because the reason that's such a great question is, 4 years ago, France mandated that all supermarkets have got to give away their produce, but they didn't have a system in place to support that. So I've never supported mandating it because I believe it's the right thing to do, and we should all be doing this because it's the right thing to do. And sometimes mandating something does not necessarily mean that it gets followed through. So I guess for me, it's all about education. It's about working with industry. In truth, any surplus food, any food business should understand their responsibility in making sure that there's no food waste. People often say to us, it's so beautiful you collect from restaurants. The truth is, a restaurant that doesn't run efficiently and we don't collect from restaurants. A restaurant that has food waste would do itself out of business in 5 minutes. Clever restaurants, smart restaurants are using, just like the Italian culture and all those cultures that create bouillabaisse because there was leftover. They create, whether it's nasi goreng or whatever, it was to use up everything they had in their kitchens. So we don't actually, so it's not about collecting food from restaurants. It's collecting food from the big manufacturers, producers, supermarkets.
I just wanted to circle back to something that you said a moment ago about mandating and how, food businesses and producers, retailers should take responsibility. Sadly, we know, we're having a conversation about humanity earlier. Humanity is not always humane, unfortunately. And sadly, we've seen that whenever big business or a lot of businesses have the opportunity, have the resources to do the right thing, they don't. Hence, one of the reasons why we have the climate crisis on emission levels and things like that. So what do you think about mandating where it's not just a legislation or policy or law that's arbitrarily created, however, it's created with follow through, with things like working groups to check progress, periodically, to ensure that the policy is having the best possible impact that it's intended to. How do you feel about that aspect of it? So not just policy created for the sake of it, but policy created with sufficient follow through. Is that a satisfactory level of mandation for you? Do you think?
I just wonder how you do the follow through. That's the point. But maybe
I mean,
like
I've seen reports where they talk about, having set up working groups.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, with local governments, or I don't know. I'm not a policymaker.
I have a view, but I want to just give Paul the opportunity because.
Well, you're probably better positioned to answer that one than I am, Ronni, because most of ours sits in behaviour change of consumers and getting them to grow food rather than advising on policy. So I'm happy.
Yeah, well, I totally believe in behaviour change and how we shift that. So that is my reason for negating mandating. However, there's no doubt that we have to shift and change the labelling laws because they're so confusing and people don't understand them, and therefore are throwing away yogurt that's perfectly good, even if they've never opened it because it said use by, and they've forgotten how to sniff, smell, they've forgotten what their grandmothers did, who didn't have fridges, who didn't have labeling dates on them.
Yeah.
So if there was a way to mandate and we could follow through on that, then perhaps telling everybody that this is that they need to make sure that there's no surplus food, and that any surplus food that there is goes to feed vulnerable people in the first instance, does not get wasted.
Yeah.
I just don't know how you do the follow through.
Sure.
I know that there's still people, I'm sure, who have made comments who are dumpster diving. We work with the supermarkets, we try so hard, and yet we know that there's still produce that's going into dumpsters. There's still people who are living off dumpsters, even if they've tried to lock them or do things. So, it's so ultimately, perhaps we do have to mandate. And we have to probably do it quicker rather than later, because there are less than 3,000 days to 2030, which is why there is such an urgency now around not wasting food. And bringing that number down, and Australia has an opportunity to be one of those very first countries that could achieve that if it did everything, and if our people leaders would follow through.
Sure. There's another question for you, Ronni. Not surprisingly, a lot of questions here. People love what you're saying. So somebody's asking, basically, do you work with partners in waste prevention, or is that more of their own responsibility?
No, absolutely. I mean, part of our whole education program is waste prevention. And we absolutely have taught so many businesses to be more efficient, to understand how they cannot waste, that, people often ask me, how come you can, you want to feed people on the one hand, but on the other, you're minimizing food waste. It's for that exact reason. Unfortunately, there is, if in Australia, it's costing us $36 billion, it's going to take a long time to bring that down. But we totally believe and know that it's part of our role to prevent good food from going to waste. That's what makes OzHarvest unique. We're working and educating around not wasting food. We just want to make sure that any surplus good produce goes to feed people rather than landfill. Or animals. If you look at the hierarchy of need, it needs to feed people.
And there's a question here from Sahar Khalili. Are supermarkets able to report on the food they send to waste versus the food they donate?
Absolutely. And we are very data driven. So we have every single item of produce that we collect is accountable. And they very much, this is costing supermarkets a lot of money, all businesses. Food waste is costing an enormous amount of money. It is in their interests to minimize that cost. So they are accountable, they understand. Absolutely, which is why in the very first instance, they started supporting us because it was costing X amount. They figured it's to invest it, a little of that in us.
Yeah. And Paul, what's the impact on climate change when it comes to food waste?
Well, one of the huge impacts is the reduction in methane emissions from when people compost. I mean, and that's just a piece of low-hanging fruit in terms of a piece of data that you can retrieve out of the impact of people composting and minimizing food waste. But really, like it's if you want to have a broader look at the picture, the inputs, resources, and time that it takes to grow that food in the first place, only to have it go into landfill as just straight mechanical environmental impacts, let alone the social impacts of a system that's skewed to, have food provisioned by, a supermarket duopoly as opposed to fostering regional food production. And for me, that great piece around food resilience and food security is a critical thing that can be addressed by people, again, just having even a small hand in growing their own food. We all know the imperfections of the supermarkets, but I think over the last couple of years, during the increasing impact of climate change from the flooding that happened as a courtesy of the La Nina events over the last 3 years, coupled with the impacts of the pandemic, we saw food insecurity through the supermarket system, regardless of the economic climate, for the very first time. I mean, for me, I'm 39 years old, and over the last 4 years is the first time I've ever been to a supermarket and seen empty shelves, and also seen that huge volatility in price that happens when climate change impacts on things. So again, encouraging people and educating people to grow food can help to mitigate those impacts of people, which are increasingly impacting people in their economic sense, in their pocket, and people are being food insecure, especially given the climate of what's happening now. And just to very quickly circle back around to what Ronni was mentioning earlier with education, in terms of behaviour change, the more that we can engage schools and the education system on this, because young people, school children, are such incredible agents of change. And just anecdotally, I've seen the power firsthand of delivering workshops to schools and to have a group of children go out and then have heard them telling their parents in the car park what is possible, with their parents going, "You can't do that," and the children pulling them straight up and going, "No, actually, this is how you do it." So to be able to engage young people, and the Feast program just sounds like such a wonderful and powerful initiative, Ronni, and I tip my hat to yourself and OzHarvest for rolling that out to thousands of schools around the country, because the more that we can engage that next generation of people, because I grew up, I think, at the root of this is our kind of diminished food culture, where we don't have that appreciation of food. We don't know how to grow food. We don't know how to prepare food. And we're just trapped in that cycle of supermarket consumption. But the more we can make it a standard that young people and everyone in our society is exposed to food culture, how to grow, how to cook, how to prepare, how to share, then in terms of behaviour change, as opposed to government mandate, then the impacts of that would be very far-reaching.
Yeah.
And Paul, just to share with our listeners the very cold hard facts. I mean, on Monday, the Food Bank Hunger Report came out, which we're very much involved in, and our data has gone into that. 3.6 million Australians are food insecure. This is in a country that is so abundantly wealthy and rich. The new demographic, given the cost of living right now, is that they are people with one job. These are people who've never, ever needed food before, who are now Googling food insecurity, food rescue, where do I get food? That our charities tell us that their demand has gone up by 50%. I've got more than 600 charities on a waiting list with a new demographic of people. So it's so, I'm really excited to share that we're just going into the Northern Territory. And the first thing we're doing in the Northern Territory is teaching people to plant gardens and to start producing and growing their own food, because we want to empower people and work very closely with those people, you know, and Paul, we need to be talking to you to work out how we do this everywhere, because it is about empowerment and it is about enabling a whole, you know, different culture.
Yeah, that is a very good segue into the next question I was going to ask, which is, well, not for me, from one of the viewers. With the rising cost of living, has any research been done on the price point that creates behavior change? You know, when people buy less or use leftovers more?
Look, it's definitely prevalent. We're seeing it right now. We're seeing, as I say, with the demand that has gone skyrocketed for surplus or rescued or produce from charitable organizations. It's our supermarkets. I think everybody is feeling that there's a shift in the buying. The research I'm reading is saying that people are buying less of certain things, more of others. House brand is booming because it's seen as more cost effective than, you know, regular brands. There's no doubt the trickle-on effect of this is still to be seen and is continuing.
Mm-hmm. So someone here says, as a dumpster diver, I'm finding it difficult increasingly to get fresh food. OzHarvest steals from Paul to pay Peter in my suburb, takes 30 kilometers and doesn't, return it to my suburb. Sorry, I missed that part of the question. But I think you get the gist of that question.
I think, just to be clear, we very much try and work locally.
Mm-hmm.
All our routes are designed that where we collect food, we deliver food. That is the most efficient way for us to work. I wouldn't see it as, because there's such a small proportion of dumpster diving, which is not the healthiest way to get your food. I would much rather get it in the first instance and be handing it out with dignity, grace, and in a safe way. All of our food is collected by people who understand safe food handling, goes into refrigerated vehicles and then delivered out. So we definitely have discouraged food suppliers from putting food into bins. That is, you know, for the very small proportion of people who have lived on dumpster diving or try and survive on that. I would much rather take it and offer it in a way that is dignified and healthy.
Okay. And what types of food do you see that are wasted the most? You know, is it only fruits and vegetables? You know, and which one seems to be the focus? This is a question from Lynette Arden.
It's milk, bread, dairy, and fresh produce. Bananas are a huge issue, and it is absolutely fresh produce, because the minute it gets that little mark, freckle, odd shape, you know, if we could rescue all of the food that was surplus, that would be useful, but we're limited by our own resources.
Yeah, of course. And Paul, speaking of, you know, foods that get wasted first, I believe some of your members do recipes and things for courses and workshops on interesting types of things to learn about using leftover food or food that you would not typically throw away because you don't think it's food, but you know it's full of nutrients anyway. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're just one spoke of a great wheel of education out there of people that are trying to inform people about how to use up food and how to be creative with recipes. And again, it goes back to that concept of food culture. And if you look at previous generations, people didn't waste because it was so precious, it was so hard to come by, and people had recipes and techniques in their arsenal for using up things. Like for bread, classically, we were making, you know, bread and butter puddings, breadcrumbs, all that kind of stuff, or at the very worst, getting fed to chickens or compost that then created eggs. So there was that circularity. And we've lost that circularity in that now we're a part of a linear supermarket supply food chain, and it kind of stops with us, the consumer. So we certainly run workshops with Grow It Local if people are out there and looking for a resource that can help educate people around what they can do with waste products. I encourage you to check out what we do, most definitely. Because yeah, I mean, I appreciate that this is a web series about, you know, about supermarkets and that aspect of the supply chain, but our insight certainly is around educating and inspiring people, because the more that we can encourage people to connect with their food, and there's so much benefit that comes from that psychologically, environmentally, and socially. We're hardwired to have a more deep and profound connection with our food, as anyone on this web series would know, that there's a great deal of personal benefit that flows from it. So yeah, if you want to learn some tips and tricks, certainly look up what we do at Grow It Local, as well as encouraging people to grow their own food.
I also want to share that in Sydney, and I know that this is national, so but I do need to point out that in Sydney, we have a restaurant called the Refectorio, which uses 95% of rescued produce. And we pickle, we ferment. The sources, the quality of the produce is absolutely beautiful. It does offer free lunch for anyone who's hungry. And on a Thursday night, it's open to pay it forward. So to experience what beautiful, gourmet, wonderful food tastes like, that's used rescued produce and surplus and ugly produce, and pays it forward to enable us to feed vulnerable people with dignity, grace, and style. It's absolutely beautiful.
I love that, with dignity, grace, and style.
It's the most important thing. Food is about dignity, grace, and style, and it's never about just handing out food for the sake of feeding people. It's about dignity. Food is dignity. Food is sharing. Food is caring.
It is. I mean, I think that's also very important to mention. You talked about new groups, a lot of charities having new demographics needing food, and, that shame and dignity that surrounds, people who are typically not experience food insecurity and having to go into that. I think it's very important to be realistic and honest, and also give them dignity with that experience. So thank you for adding that to your wheelhouse. One of the things I wanted to call for you to mention is, I know that with some of the communities you work with that grow food, swapping produce, you mentioned a couple of times that you can't grow your own food. You're not expected to grow everything that you eat. However, it's helpful when communities swap produce whenever there's excess. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, certainly. And for me, that's about a decentralization of the food system. I mean, it's the polar opposite of a supermarket duopoly. And I've seen, in the chat, I'm kind of keeping an eye on that, a couple of mentions about food system centralization. And it's not just because we put huge amounts of power into the hands of corporate organizations like our supermarket duopoly, but it's also we expose ourselves more deeply to the impacts of climate change, because a centralized food system is not a resilient food system, and an agricultural food system that's built upon monoculture and its ability to be able to transport food is not a resilient food system. And we've certainly seen the impacts of that over the last couple of years, classically with the potato shortage and with the $10 lettuce scandal, the $10 lettuces making the headlines, which was mind-boggling for anyone that has grown any sort of food. You can grow 100 lettuces from a $3.50 packet of seed, and that's really accessible to really even a beginner grower. Anyone. They're one of the easiest things to grow. So it was kind of interesting. I scratched my head to see that it had gotten to that point. But the more that we can foster these community connections, because another great behavior change that happens when people start to grow food is that they start to connect with a broader community around growing food and celebration of food culture. We come together to share in our abundance, and anyone that's even grown one zucchini plant will appreciate just how abundant plants can be. It shifts our mindset from that scarcity where we're all competing for resources to going, well, I've got all this stuff and I want to share it with my community. And we're about able to build connection and ritual and contact with each other around that. And these, not only are we making our communities more resilient through connecting and sharing food, but also, it's not just in the face of climate change, it's the face of social disaster as well, because we know that there's an epidemic of loneliness sweeping the world, and food is such a powerful way to bring people together and share that common table and connect with one another. And anyone that's had lived experience with severe crisis, we certainly lived through it on the far south coast of New South Wales here during the Black Summer, was that community connection was essential to recovery, and food sat at the top of the hierarchy around how people began that journey to recovery after a significant disaster.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for ending off with explaining the power of food. I think that's a good place. Yeah, very beautiful. And that's such a perfect place to sign off with the questions. And now I'm just going to ask each of you if you can give just one very quick call to action that you feel would make a big difference in reducing our food waste. I know we've mentioned that a lot, talked about, consumer, we all have to take responsibility, but what's the one very specific direct action that each individual can do that would make the biggest difference?
Well, from our points of view, what we know is if you make a shopping list, if you're going shopping, make a shopping list. Look what's in your pantry before you make a shopping list. Buy what you need, eat it, and use it up. It's a very powerful way of saving money and saving our planet. And food is absolutely, as Paul said, food is the connector, food is dignity, food is sharing, and we need to protect our planet. So we need to buy what we need and use it and cook it or grow it. Growing it is divine.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ronni. And Paul?
I think for me, the number one piece of advice, 2 words: grow food. Doesn't have to be all of it. Doesn't have to be, you don't have to have aspirations to be self-sufficient. You don't have to live on a 20-acre hobby farm. You can live in a rental unit and just have 2 50-centimeter pots growing lettuce that you can move from rental to rental. You can have a plot in a community garden. You can take over your verge. You can take over your backyard. Wherever you are, no matter your circumstances, at least the tiniest little bit, grow food.
Perfect. Thank you so much. You've both been phenomenal. We'll have to wrap it up there. And this has been such a fantastic discussion. So I will give my call to action. So our food waste report with the Australia Institute was published recently. If you haven't seen it, visit our website, australiainstitute.org.au. And in the search bar, just type in food waste report and it should come up, probably the second option. Have a look at it. And if you have if you work in the food distribution, food charity, farming, food waste reduction, or anything similar, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. So if you have policy recommendations that can help reach, the 2030 food reduction target of Australia, please email at mail@australiainstitute.org.au with food waste report in the subject line. And I'll repeat that email address. It's mail@australiainstitute.org.au. So please be genuine with your recommendations. Please be constructive. If it's anything other than that, we'll probably just get deleted. And again, I'd like to thank Ronni Kahn and Paul West for the wonderful conversation. And I want to thank everyone who's joined this webinar and for your great questions and your support. Make sure you're subscribed to our podcast called Follow the Money. Subscribe on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Now, our Revenue Summit 2023 is this Friday at Parliament House in Canberra. Most of us don't live in Canberra. However, it's a revenue summit that's going to explore revenue raising options to meet Australia's growing public spending needs. So there will be a huge range of speakers. Find tickets on our website. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Get
Bye-bye.
your use it up tape.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.